Hello and welcome to the British Sitcom History Podcast. My name is Alan. With me, as always, is Gareth.
Hello.
Hello. And today we're going way back.
Way back to black and white.
To black and white days. We're going back to LWT's first sort of big sitcom success.
Okay.
I don't think it was their first sitcom, but it was shortly after LWT, London Weekend Television, began.
Right.
1968. The show is, of course, Please Sir. Please Sir!
Yes.
An exclamation mark.
You know how I love exclamation marks in my television titles. Or any punctuation, really. Just does my head in. Anyway, before we do get into Please Sir, you mentioned LWT. You always send me these clips to watch. And I assume they're usually from a DVD that you've ripped. But these all had the London Weekend Television ident on them at the start.
Yeah.
Was that on the DVD? Because I've got to say, I had a real sense of nostalgia from seeing that little ident. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, that's just on part. It's part of the program. It's just the producers, make at the beginning.
Sure.
That's what you get. Yeah, but they do a vote, and you get the same with some of the others, Granada and all that. But it's it takes you back a little bit because obviously we don't have regions quite in the same way these days.
And it was interesting, wasn't it? Like back we used to have the ITV regions. We grew up in Yorkshire and Tyne Tees and all those sorts of things, and they produced their own television programs which would go out across the network. So you would see those other logos. But London was interesting, wasn't it? Because it was Thames during the week and LWT. What was it like? Friday night to Sunday night? How did it work?
That's right. Yeah, from Friday. Oh God, I'm doing this off my head, but like Friday from 7, I think it was, like after the news, through to Sunday at similar sort of time. But it's the weekend, London Weekend Television, because the television at the weekend was a totally different beast to the weekdays.
Completely
different. It still is.
That's true. That's true. It is. Listen, I feel like we got a little sidetracked early doors here. Shall we get back to Please Sir and the actual subject of our podcast? And just to preempt, the episode that we're going to be looking at in detail is from Series 2, Episode 13. It's called Dress Circle. So we will go through that episode in a lot of detail, and we'll do what we usually do. We'll use the scenes in that episode to jump off and talk about some of the actors and characters and so on. But just give us a bit of background on Please Sir. So you said 1968. Just give us the dates, give us the deets.
So Series 1. First series there, 1968, late 68, November, December, it went out. 7 episodes, so pretty standard. Then second series the next year in 13 episodes, followed up with Series 3 a year later, 14 episodes.
Okay, that's interesting. So again, we've talked about this before when we did the Army game recently. There wasn't a standard, was there? It wasn't like 6 is normal or 13 is normal. There wasn't a normal, but back then. So they're still trying to establish patterns. Yeah,
I think the BBC was definitely more of a vibe of that 6 episodes, maybe 7 if they've got an extra week to fill. The thing with a 13 or 14 episodes is it's a quarterly thing, isn't it? It's kind of fitting a schedule, and so you just need 4 things on rotation to fill your Friday night slot or whatever it is, and so they do it for that reason. Really, it's all about that. Although then you have a few weeks off over Christmas because everything just goes haywire and you're doing different things. But yeah, it's seasonal. Those first 3 series, which were just one year to the next, pretty standard as you think that. That's really what we're going to be looking at as what is Please Sir, but it did go on after that. There was a 4th series as well.
This is interesting. So we've decided, haven't we, for the purposes of this review, that we're going to talk about the first 3 series as our canon Please Sir.
Yeah.
And you want to treat the 4th series as something different.
So after Series 3, we'll get into this a bit more, but basically the school children, they leave the school. And so for Series 4, they try and bring in that's sort of the same staff, but we lose our main teacher, we lose our main pupil. So it becomes a very different beast. We'll talk about that it is. But because it's so different, it feels like it's a sequel of sorts. But then there was an actual sequel called The Fen Street Gang, where we follow what the students do after they've left school. Which it's almost like it branches into 2 halves.
Literally,
one of them is still called Please Sir. But that's the official that's the continuation. But in reality, it's just as cut off from the original 3 series, as in my opinion.
It's like 2 new species evolving from the first.
Exactly, yeah. So we'll talk about that. But I think just to talk about the canon, it's the first 3 series and the film spin-off.
Yes.
And the episode we're looking at is the last episode of series 2. So really, when it's definitely got its footing by then, it knows what it's doing. So it's a good example of what the show is.
Well, the other thing I wanted to talk about in terms of production notes is that black and white colour thing. So the first series was in black and white, but then the second in colour, right?
That's right, the first series, yeah. And by the time they were filming the second series, they went full colour about halfway through the series in terms of the network they were
I see.
They were putting out in colour, but they filmed them all in colour because they obviously knew this was coming up. And so they were thinking ahead to, when we repeat this, we're going to have them in colour.
So that's interesting. So the first few episodes would have gone out black and white, even though they were filmed colour.
Of series 2, yes. And then just as while you're on that topic, the end of series 3 are in black and white, the last 4 episodes. That was because of the colour strike at ITV, which affected all the shows at the time. So just a little footnote of history there.
Well, okay, so that's a nice bit of background. Let's set up the series itself. So it's a school. It's a school in London. And we have a class, 5C, who it's set up in the first episode that they're the class that no one wants to teach. Their form teacher has gone off sick. And the new teacher, played by John Alderton, Mr. Hedges, gets kind of lumbered with this class. That's how it's all set up. And I guess the 3 series, I'm not sure about timelines, but is that supposed to be 3 terms of their last year? Is that how it's set up?
Yeah, that is correct, yeah.
Okay.
And a very definite kind of, the end of the series is like, oh, it's the end of the term. We're coming back next time. So actually, I think that's quite neat, actually. It works out nicely.
Yeah, it does. It does. So let's talk about the massive problem, the elephant in the room, is that all the actors who play these kids, they're all well into their 20s, even at the start, aren't they? They're all way too old.
Yes.
Are they supposed to be 16 or 18?
They're 15, really, at the start of the year. They're going to be 16 by the time they leave. So in theory, they're 15.
Listen, we've got 6 main, I'm going to say child characters, even though they're not child actors. Without us getting into too much detail about the individuals, can you just reel off for me their ages at the start of this, if they're all supposed to be 15?
Well, the youngest one was Malcolm McPhee, who would have been 19.
Right.
The oldest is actually David Barry, who would have been 25.
Wow, 25. Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, they're obviously all older than 16, but yeah, I mean, that's a big jump, isn't it?
And then part of the problem is as well, it's obviously very standard to have adults playing teenagers in these shows, but you tend to find adults who look younger than they are. Whereas you've got Peter Cleal, who plays Duffy. He would have been 24 when the show started, and he looks 35 then.
Peter Cleal looks like... I tell you what I kept thinking. Peter Cleal looks like a first division footballer of the time. He looks like he was left back for Ipswich Town, and he would have broken your legs as soon as you look at you. But if you go back and look at all those, like if you look at old football stickers from the 70s and 80s, all of those lads look in their 50s, even though they're only 20. And that's Peter Cleal's problem. He's playing 15, he's 24, and he looks 39.
And a hard life 39 as well.
Yeah, yes. He looks like he's been working in a factory for 20 years. So look, I dare say we're going to talk about this a lot because it has a tendency to take you out of the drama from time to time. But I suppose you just have to suspend your disbelief a little bit, don't you?
Do you know what? I've been thinking about this because and from what I understand, it was noticed at the time. It was like even when the show was out, it was the thing people always said about it. And yeah, I was just saying like, well, it's just one of those things, but. The more and more I think about it, I think it actually does affect the show and how we watch it. So I might talk a bit more about that later, but
we'll come back to that,
I do
definitely.
think it's an issue, yes.
They're not like kids at all, they're so hard-bitten.
Mutations, that's what they are, boy. Little pubescent bodies and the minds of hardened old lags.
John Alderton, who's playing the teacher, is only a few years older than them.
Well, I suppose but that is realistic because if you think about this, he's on his first day as a teacher. He's an idealistic young teacher. So how old would he be realistically? He'd probably be 23 or 24. I think John Alderton's too old to be playing that role as well.
Yeah, and the whole setup is he's new, and so he's got this ideological. He's deliberately gone to a crappy little comprehensive in the East End of London because that's where he can do the most good. And so when he gets dumped with the degenerate class, he embraces it.
Yeah,
and let's face it, over the course of the series, has a very profound impact.
He does a great job
and does a really good job.
I think it's great. I really do. We can perhaps come to this in our conclusions, but I think it's quite heartwarming, really, the way he charms them and he helps them, he educates them.
Yes, because the other half of the show really is the staff side of the school, and they are all just cynical,
dysfunctional
children.
And that's pretty squalid, the staff room, isn't it?
Yeah. Which is probably quite realistic, but
yeah. Well, we'll get into this in more detail as we go through the episode. What I'd like to do is start with the theme tune. I think it's perfect. It's got the school bell kind of motif running through it. But yeah, it's great. Like we talk about the opening titles. It's like a sort of 30-second long, quite long opening titles. And we also have all the kids in the playground. There's a sort of anarchic feel to what's going on. They're all sort of running around playing football, getting kicked around, gets kicked at Hedges, then it gets kicked at Potter. And we are introduced to our actors in that way. But it's a great setup. The music is great. And we just sort of see this school-based chaos.
Interesting, though, just as we start, though, those titles, I have a little story about that. And now's a good time to introduce a book that I've read.
A book what you read?
A book what I read called Please Sir, the Official History. It seemed the logical thing to read. Right?
I'm looking forward to hearing about this, yeah.
So this is a book written by David Barry, who is the actor who plays Frankie Abbott in Please Sir. And he, a few years ago, he took it upon himself to write a kind of potted history of Please Sir. Now, I will say, Please Sir, the Official History is a bit of a misleading title. This is very much David Barry's professional memoirs. It's him talking about his working life.
Okay.
Please Sir is obviously a very big chunk of that. But having said that, really great book, actually. I do recommend it. I'm going to be dropping out a few facts from this that I've read, and I've made a few notes. So I just want to credit that for a start. But also, I do recommend it if anyone who's interested in this show, particularly, but in general sitcom history, because basically a guy who was working in this industry throughout the 70s, particularly, and what do these guys do when the TV series finishes and the work isn't flooding in? Like, what are they doing? It's an interesting account of an actor in the 70s.
And is it available? How could our listeners buy it?
Yeah, good question, because if you Google it, you'll find people selling it, but I think he may have his own website where you can buy it. So it's out there. If you Google it, you'll find somewhere selling it. But I happened to buy mine from David Barry himself, and he signed it for me. I met him at an event I went to recently, where a load of sitcom stars were just chatting about their time. Organised.
So that's the way we spend our weekends.
Yeah, exactly. One of the events organised by Robert Ross, who seems to be the man who does all that stuff in the world of sitcoms and Carry On. But I went to that quite recently, which I may tell you a bit more about that as we go along, because there was some interesting things. In fact, shall we just have a little sidebar and I'll tell you about that?
Let's do it. Let's give David a really big plug for his book. See if we can boost his sales.
So I went to this event, which was called Sitcom Legends, I think it was, in Watford, and basically it was a whole day, but Robert Ross interviewing, but just having a bit of a chat with some sitcom stars, really.
Some anecdotes.
Just allowing them an opportunity to tell some anecdotes. Jeffrey Holland was there. He's always there. Jeffrey Holland's always good for an anecdote. Yeah. And David Barry and Penny Spencer, who plays Sharon in Please Sir, were both there as well. The other biggest name who was there was Brian Murphy, who, of course, is George Roper, George and Mildred.
Yeah.
Who is 90 years old now. And he was fit as a fiddle. Well, he's fit as a sort of 90-year-old fiddle, but, he was he seemed to be doing well.
In good form.
Yeah, very cracking, a lot of jokes. Really funny.
I recently saw Brian Murphy. I was watching Mrs. Merton and Malcolm, and he's playing, an old man in that.
Yeah,
I realised this is 25 years ago, and he's still kicking. He's still going strong. Good lad.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. Brian Murphy is married to Linda Regan, who we talked about last week.
In Heidi High.
Because she was in Heidi High. And Linda Regan has a connection to Please Sir, kind of, as well, which I'll come to that later, though. But that's just a little sneak peek.
Now you've intrigued me.
In a very vague, or sort of tangential connection to David Barry and Frankie Abbott. So the day was very interesting. We sort of heard all these stories, and David Barry was there and signing copies of his book. Not just this one, he also writes novels. I'll talk to you a bit about that later when we go through some of the actors. But yeah, he signed it for me, and I have read it. And now I'm going to impart some of the interesting little tidbits that are very specific to Please Sir. But there's lots more in this book. So
we'll not talk about this on the podcast. But you sent me some absolutely thermonuclear gossip about Rodney Bewes. Let's just leave that. Our listeners will have to buy the book if they want to read that.
I will say, what I do, I did really enjoy reading this, actually. I whipped through it pretty quickly, and here's 2 points, right? David Barry's not afraid to slag a couple of people off. I appreciate that, because I like getting the nitty gritty. I don't just want to hear all the like David Jason isn't going to slag anyone off in his autobiography, right?
No.
So
way too nice.
He's still too. I think he's just
too much to lose
to the industry.
Alan, too much to lose.
Yeah. But also, here's the major thing I took from reading this book, right? Everyone in the entertainment industry in the 70s was an alcoholic. Every anecdote is, and so was we had trouble because he couldn't remember his lines because he was drunk. So and so would get drunk, but never so drunk before a show that he couldn't perform. Every single anecdote is someone was an alcoholic.
So many of them died young, didn't they? Like, you always, I remember in the 80s, it'd be on the news, so and so has died. Tommy Cooper has died. I don't know how old Tommy Cooper was, but he was not an old man. Like all those entertainers and comedians, and they lived hard, didn't they?
Well, one of the specific stories in this book mentions James Beck, who makes a guest appearance in an episode of the Fenn Street Gang when he was in his dad's army fame. And David Barry says they got on quite well, and he bumped into him again 6 weeks later and went, "Oh, hi, James," and he didn't know who he was.
Wow.
And then, James Beck was dead pretty shortly after that.
Yeah.
So, but yeah.
Is it the curse of the Fenn Street Gang?
No, it's the curse of being an alcoholic. But it does just seem to be ingrained into the actor's world, especially in the theatre world. You go and do a show, you get out at 10 o'clock.
You're working late hours,
yeah. Yeah, and you don't have to get up in the morning. So
yeah, interesting.
He also tells an anecdote about a specific theatre that had a little ladder in the back, in the wings, where you could go up, open a trapdoor, and it got you up into the bar of the dress circle. So during the show, you didn't have to go out. You could stay backstage and get a drink. Excellent.
So do you think that's changed now? If you were at a West End production now, are they all going out for kombuchas afterwards? I don't even know what kombucha is.
I think it's definitely changed to an extent, but I will say that, when we've seen shows and we go, this is a bit sloppy, it's not put together that well. This is part of it. Not that they were drunk doing it necessarily, although some of them were, but there seems to be not a lack of professionalism exactly, but an ability to get away with not being professional by enough people that it's affecting the
I think there's also an element, like I've watched, in the last couple of weeks, I've watched not as many episodes of this as you, but probably, 10 or 12. And there's a lot of, like, seeing the boom mic or someone walking in front of camera, and you kind of see those errors. Now, we've talked about this before. This would have gone out once, maybe been repeated once, but it wasn't people watching. People can rewind and say, did I just see a boom mic then? So you could get away with more. I think that is factually accurate.
Yeah, and here's another thing, and this comes up in David Barry's book as well. He talks about the producer-director Mark Stewart, who did most of the second series and was involved in the producer, if not director, throughout the entire run, including Fenn Street Gang, all this, right? And had a very expansive career, Mark Stewart. And just, David Barry is not particularly pleasant about him in the book, but is sort of, doesn't really slag him off either. But my read of it was, this guy's a total dick.
Really?
Like he has an extremely short fuse, would shout at people, would just insult them to their face. And his main focus, and I'm sort of reading between the lines here, but his main focus was, let's get this done, get out, get to the pub, and get on with our lives, because I don't care. There's no kind of artistic integrity involved. They just want to, I'm here to do a job. You stand there, move over to that bit, say these words, and then I'll point a camera at you.
Yeah, I suppose there's no... Esmond and Larby write the scripts. All the actors are there to perform. He's just creating a product, isn't he?
And he was not interested. If you flubbed a line, then you flubbed a line, mate. That's on you. I'm not doing another take. Yeah. So, that's why you get those elements. You get the boom mic in shot and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
It's, So I'll drop a few more facts on you that I've got specifically from David Barry's book. But yeah, I think it was a really good read, so I do recommend it.
Shall we move on to our episode then? So we've talked about the opening titles, and scene 1 opens up in the classroom. We have a few sets, the classroom and the staff room being the primary ones. There's also a lot of corridor action, and we have a few outside broadcasts. But for now, we start in the classroom. There's chaos. There's no teacher in the room, and the kids they're playing table tennis with books, which I like. That's very creative. And we sort of get a brief introduction to our main child characters. So there's a whole class of kids. There's a big room full of extras. Interestingly, all the extras also look in their 20s. Like, they couldn't have just got 16-year-olds in as extras, because that would have made the main cast look even more ridiculous. So shall we just talk a little bit about our 6 main kids? 4 boys, 2 girls. Yeah. Which is interesting dynamic. I feel sure that nowadays you would have 3 boys and 3 girls in that situation.
Maybe, yeah, maybe.
So yeah, let's go through them one by one and just give a brief pencil sketch.
Yeah, go on then. Let's start with the leader, the de facto leader, Duffy.
Duffy is sort of literally front and centre. He sits at the front desk. And this is Peter Cleal. And as we've already discussed, he looked 40. But he's a geezer, isn't he? I mean, he's loud and he's obnoxious. Like, I don't think he delivers a line at less than 11 out of 10 in the whole series.
It's best whenever he does the line, "Well, what are we supposed to do? We're just little kiddies, aren't we?" Yeah, all right.
But he is the leader, isn't he? He's the ringleader. He's the other characters sometimes literally look to him for guidance in terms of what they should be doing.
But a benevolent leader.
He's not a bully.
Well, I wanted to bring this up in this scene particularly because another kid walks from one of the other classes, 5A, who's like the smart kids, walks in, and just immediately there is like slurs pelted at him just because he's not one of them. And then whenever he talks, they mock him just because he doesn't talk with a common accent like
I will say this. So yeah, the reason it's a nice contrast, and it's, as you say, it's a nice way of demonstrating that it's us against the rest of the school.
Cheer one, Puffy. All right, Duffy. Yes, Farmer, what is it?
Please, sir, Mr. Wyatt says, have you got the tickets for 5A?
Please, Mr. Wyatt says. All right, shut up.
But I will say this: the kid who comes in, it's way too big a contrast. Like, how is that kid in that school? He's like, he should be at Eton or Wickham or something. Do you know what I mean?
It's interesting because there's a similar thing happens in the film where they kind of get into a competitive nature with this other school, and they're the posh kids, right? But what I find interesting about that, and what really jumped out to me about this scene, is that we don't particularly often see them outside of their own little bubble.
No.
And even if they do, if we see them going up against some of the kids, it's usually a relatively fair kind of like, we're going at each other kind of thing. Whereas this kid walks in and it's bullying. And that is significant because, like I say, Duffy is not a bully and often is the voice of moral good. Mm-hmm. You know, he will often kind of be the ringleader who says, oh, look, do you know what? We've done wrong by the teacher and we're going to make it up to him.
Yeah.
For what he appears to be, he's not aggressive. He's ready to fight if he needs to, but he's not an aggressive person. He's not looking for a fight. And I didn't particularly like this scene because of how they come across, which is not how we usually see them.
I agree. I think Duffy is fundamentally a good man, isn't he? Good boy.
Who else have we got here then?
Well, let's talk about the boys first. So we have Frankie Abbott, who is a little bit of a fantasist. I really don't like Frankie Abbott. In contrast, Frankie Abbott seems like a nasty piece of work, really. You know, he makes stories up, he invents things, and he's also got really nasty. Like, so for example, when this other kid leaves the room, he says, "I'd stick his foot in a bath of acid if I had my way." I'm like, Jesus, Frankie, calm down. Yeah. Bath of acid? Where's that coming from?
Well, that's it. He is a fantasist, and that's why you kind of get away with all that stuff. He says some really quite horrific things. He's going to set his mum's hair on fire and stuff like that. But you know he's never going to do any of it, and I guess that's why we can get away with that. And it's interesting, like we were saying about the kids being too old, the actors being too old. They also act too old. They don't act like 15, 16-year-olds very often. And Frankie Abbott is kind of the opposite of that because he acts like an 8-year-old. But it is called out that is his character. He's childish, he's a mummy's boy and a fantasist. And, that's what he's got going on. But let's compare and contrast that to, say, Jay from The Inbetweeners, who is now the kind of classic really example of a fantasist.
I was going to bring up The Inbetweeners later, actually. That is the best comparison of them all, yeah.
This feels like, this guy's just like an 8-year-old child who's being petulant and making up stories, whereas Jay feels like a 16-year-old who's making up stories, and it is a different thing.
We sort of said when we did The Inbetweeners that, Jay, in the main, doesn't get called out. People, they just roll their eyes and let him get on with it, and that's exactly the same with Frankie here. Nobody ever says, come on, you're making that up, Frankie. Even though they all know he is, they just let him get on with it.
But he never makes up anything with any consequence at all. It's like, no. It's always just like, oh yeah, I'm a spy. I work for the CIA. You don't know about it.
He's gone big, hasn't he?
It's just completely nonsense.
Well, one of the other boys is Peter Craven, played by Malcolm McPhee. Now, I'm going to be honest with you up front here. I really like Craven. I think he's great. Firstly, I love his style. He's Dapper Dan, and he looks great. And that's his character. He's a bit of a ladies' man.
That really comes to the fore in this episode.
Unlike Frankie, he really is a ladies' man. Which, again, we can talk about the appropriateness of that for 15-year-olds, and we'll probably get to that with the girls. But yeah, I really like Craven. He's kind of a bit of a geezer, but yeah, he knows what's going on.
Peter Craven, played by Malcolm McPhee. I feel he's the most underserved character in these Principal Six kids.
It left me wanting more. I always wanted to see more of him, yeah.
And I think that might be because he's not the biggest character, like someone like Frankie Abbott. It's just something more obvious about it. Where I think what he's doing is a bit more subtle, dare I say.
Yeah.
I think he develops a lot more in the Fen Street Gang, actually, because we see him go off and he starts working for a gangster, basically. We sort of start to get... And we certainly see more of his ladies' man side, because he actually... I think they have a bit more freedom to actually get him hooking up with women.
So the fourth of our boys is Dennis Dunstable, played by our favourite Peter Denyer from Dear John.
Certainly wasn't our favourite from Dear John, I should say.
No. But in Dear John, he plays Ralph, who's obviously this sort of nerd character, bit of an idiot. But in Dennis Dunstable, and I'm going to be a little bit careful here, are we talking about a bit of an idiot, or are we someone with learning difficulties? Where are we?
You don't have a go at Dunstable, sir. He's ESN.
And what do you understand ESN to mean?
Same as you. He's educationally subnormal, isn't he? He's a bit funny. You know what I mean?
Dennis is very much positioned as a kid with special needs and in a school system that is not set up to deal with that. Mm-hmm. Of all the characters, this is one of the most interesting. I'm not sure we ever dig into it enough for my taste, because not only does he have special needs and so he is academically, very foolish, they play on that for laughs sometimes, but this is the difference. Whereas Frankie Abbott, his stupidity is funny. Yeah. I don't think they really play for that with Dennis. He says some silly things and his friends and the people around him are extremely supportive of him.
Yes, and that's the thing about, we were talking about bullying. He would be a target for bullying, one would think, but he's not. He's very much part of the group. He's looked after. Maureen has always got the metaphorical arm around him and looking after him. It's he's part of the group very much.
The other aspect, I find this a fascinating character. The other aspect of his character is he is poor, and I mean all these kids are working class, like not well off kids, but he is in extreme poverty.
Yeah.
And again, something that could easily be bullied for in a school, but they rally around to look after him.
Yeah.
And another aspect is his father is a deadbeat alcoholic who beats him and his mother. And that is referenced quite a lot.
Referenced.
And there is a little bit, as the character develops, of him finally fighting back and standing up to her, and there's a bit of resolution to that. But it's really interesting that this was just positioned as, well, this is, some kids live like this, and this is one of the characters that we're having. It's not dropped in as an episode the teacher finds out and is like, ooh, I'm going to go in and save the day.
No, this is life. This is not going to change. He's not going to be saved. But I think that would have been relatable in 1970. I think everybody would have known a kid like that at school,
The characters are all, and this goes for the whole thing, they're very one-dimensional. You're the tough one, you're the stupid one, you're the pretty one kind of vibe. Yeah. It feels like that's the synopsis you wrote on the back of a napkin when you were coming up with the idea, and it never developed beyond that. And then obviously it does a little bit as they go along. I think the Fen Street Gang benefits from that development. We'll talk about that later. But yeah, then when you've got the staff side as well, it's just there's way too many things going on for the show to deal with. Let's talk about our last two students. Let's
talk about the girls.
ladies.
Yeah. So firstly, we have Penny Spencer as Sharon.
Mm-hmm.
I would characterize Sharon as I'm going to use the euphemism worldly wise. She's streetwise.
Well, it feels like Sharon is written as like she's the pretty one. Everyone's trying to get off with her, and she's dating older men. And she specifically is like she's seeing some guy, and he thinks she's a air hostess, and she's like, "Oh God, he can't find out I'm a schoolgirl." You know, like that. Obviously, that would ruin it.
So I think we now have to address this sexual. Like we get away with this because the actors are all in their 20s. But this whole show, a massive part of the premise here is the sexualization of children. There is no way this show would be made in this way now.
Well,
the in-betweeners, they're sexualized in the way that 16-year-olds are. They're desperately trying to have sex and with people their own age and are being very unsuccessful. What we have here is children flirting with adults, flirting with teachers, behaving in an adult sexualized way. It's very different.
Well, I'll tell you about Sharon specifically because as her character goes along, in the Fen Street Gang, spoiler alert, her and Duffy end up together as a couple, and there is very much an insinuation on, like, we see them getting married, and then on their wedding night they're like, oh God, first time ever, ooh, it's finally going to do it. The idea, and both for her and Duffy, is that they've never had sex before.
Okay.
And for all that Sharon is like the sexy one, and that is kind of how she's positioned, she rebuffs all these advances, and she's a good go, right? Yeah. So in terms of the show sexualizing them, or her specifically, it's usually the other teen boys going, oh yeah, she's a bit all right, yeah, she's all right.
Well, let me talk about, if I can jump out of this episode for a moment and talk about the very first episode. Yeah. In fact, the very first scene, which is on a school bus. So we see all the kids on a bus on their way to school, and Mr. Hedges arrives. He's on the same bus, he's going to the same school, but they don't know him, and so there's a little bit of interaction which becomes embarrassing later. But one of the very first scenes, Hedges drops something, leans down, and we get a sort of leery look at Sharon's legs, and then she sort of pulls this coquettish face at him. Ooh, that sort of thing. It's all incredibly sexualized. Now, I played this to my partner, who is a teacher of secondary school children, and she just like, red flag, call social services. So basically, what she's saying is that when you have a teenager who is exhibiting that kind of overt sexual behavior, that's basically a flag that they have had a sexual relationship with an adult who knows more about it than they do. Now, things might have been different in 1970, I'm sure. But several times this made me feel uncomfortable. Again, we get away with it because the actress is 23. But if she's 15, this is not appropriate.
Yeah, and in that's just use that scene as a specific example in the opening scene. He doesn't know she's a schoolgirl. She's just a woman on a bus. Sure. So if she looks 23, Also, the idea of a 15-year-old or a 16-year-old having sexual interests and giving the eye to some handsome man on the bus is not particularly overt sexual behavior. That feels like that would be fairly normal. But also, this is a time where these people, and indeed we see it, they get married in the Fen Street Gang. Like, you're married, you've got your first kid by 19.
Sure. It's a different time. That's what we're saying. It was a different time.
I think, having watched the whole thing, I think for the most part, there's nothing too kind of like, oh my God, I can't believe they're doing that.
The thing is, it genuinely is a different time. I am saying I feel a little uncomfortable, and I do. But if we talk about the fictional character of Sharon, it's perfectly plausible that once she has her 16th birthday, she could get married. She could get married before she leaves school. She could be on page 3 of The Sun with a top off.
Yeah.
Like 16 is 16. That's fine. That was the culture then.
And like I say, there is a sense later on that she is chaste in her morals because she.
Listen, I'm not judging Sharon.
No, but she certainly had the opportunity, obviously, to have a bit of shenanigans if she wants. I found that a lot more unrealistic. This concept that her and Duffy had never conjugated
by the time they get married.
Like no chance. Come on.
Yeah, that does sound unlikely.
But we even see at the later end of Please Sir himself, John Alderton, playing Bernard Hedges, gets married. And there is very much an insinuation that he and his wife on their wedding night have never done the do before. And there's a whole kind of build-up to that where they've bought their flat and they're decorating it and they've got a bed in there, but they're not living there yet because they're not married.
That's a hell of a gamble, isn't it?
Temptation.
Can you imagine? Like, I know that was perhaps the norm. I'm not sure that it was the norm, but it was what everybody said was the norm. But, what if you buy a flat and you buy the furniture and you get married and it's like, oh, this isn't very good.
Well, yeah.
I genuinely think that, if you look back at 1960 or if you look back at 1360, I don't think it's true that people got married before they had sex. I think that's just what the church said and wrote down.
Let's transition that into Maureen, the other female character.
So Maureen, yes, as is the other girl, and her character is best summed up by the fact that she has a crush on Mr. Hedges throughout. She's really got the hots for him. But I think this is all right. This is a teenager having a crush on a slightly older adult man, and it's not inappropriate. I mean, it is inappropriate, but it's realistic.
Yeah. The only thing that comes across inappropriate, and again, it's really mild, is some of the things he does. Not to encourage it, he certainly doesn't encourage it, but he doesn't kind of shut it down immediately, which I think you would.
Yes, which you absolutely would, yes.
But, I think that is just slightly different. I think that the main difference is that Sharon looks a certain way and is treated a certain way by men. And has, at an early age, learned how to use that and how to control that. She has to, otherwise she would be taken advantage of. And I think the idea is that Maureen is a little bit more innocent. And she is a hardened Catholic, and she talks about this a lot. At one point, she tries to become a nun. Yeah, her little lust, shall we say, but love for Sir is her one little kind of vice that she allows herself.
So that's our class. That's our, as I say, we've got a bunch of extras behind them, but they're our kids. They're 5C.
Yeah.
Let's return to the plot and finish that scene. So we talked about the posh kid coming in, and the reason that he's come in is to get the theatre tickets from Mr. Hedges. And this prompts a little bit of, how come we haven't got any tickets? Yeah. And he basically plays them. He does a bit of reverse psychology on them. Didn't think you'd want to go. Yeah, we definitely do. And he gets them all to the theatre. What I really like about that is he pulls out the tickets and says, I just happen to have another 35 here. He's played them. They know he's played them, but everyone's kind of all right with it.
Yeah, and like I say, this is the end of series 2, so we've established this rapport between them now. Whereas, in the early series, he has to kind of win them over, and there's a bit more of a battle to it.
Okay, so our next scene, we cut to outside the school, and presumably the next morning, and it's Sharon and Maureen. They have a little chat, and then they take their coats off to reveal they're both wearing these, I'm going to use the word, risque dresses. What happens next is the first of several funny reaction shots as the male adult members of the cast see Sharon and Maureen and do this classic double take. The first one is Miss Ewell, the deputy head, who is driving a car and does a big double take and then almost crashes the car into Potter, who's on his bike. And do you remember when we watched Roll Over Beethoven and we saw the worst bicycle crash ever created in film?
Yeah.
I think this might be the second worst, as Potter,
I did make a note of this,
quotes, crashes into this car.
And also a real bit of business that he basically just has to throw the bike on the ground because it comes about a foot away from him.
Yeah, he's nowhere near. Which is fine. They don't want someone to get knocked off their bike. But yeah, you can't have it both ways. Potter's furious, but because the head is in the car, he's obsequious about it. That's the way he works. And then to finish this scene, Potter now sees the girls in their dress, does a big old double take, and accidentally reverses over his own bike. So, that's the sort of cartoonish scene. But before we move on, shall we talk a little bit about some of the characters we just met? I think Potter, first of all, he's the sort of antagonist to Hedges, isn't he?
Potter is a big character, played by Derek Geiler.
He's the school caretaker.
He is the school caretaker, but with that kind of little Napoleon complex, he runs the place and will let you know it. He used to be a desert rat, so he's got a sort
and
of
will let you know it
bearing. Yes, that really reminded me of Dinner Ladies.
Yes,
with our
Duncan
fastidious
Preston
janitor. But obviously, time had passed, so it had to be his dad who was a desert rat.
Yeah, but you could. I think Duncan Preston in Dinner Ladies could. We met his dad, didn't we? He was played by Eric Sykes. That could be Potter. That could be Potter in his retirement.
Yeah. Well, Derek Geiler went on to be in Sykes, Eric Sykes' sitcom.
Did he?
As a regular character. Yeah, one of his main roles there. So there's certainly connections there. It's probably not a coincidence. When Victoria Wood was writing that character, that's probably a little connection there. But perhaps typical of this kind of 20 years after the war, These people who were sort of still living on those glory days, and putting down the people who didn't go, and you just did your national service. Oh well, yeah, that's all good, well and good, but so you can look down on the younger generation, as we all like to do.
The thing is, when we first meet Potter, in the very first episode, basically he and Hedges have a run-in. And Hedges, sort of says, I'm a teacher. Who the hell do you think you are, this caretaker? And all the other teachers go, oh my goodness, you're not falling out with Potter. He's going to make your life hell. That sort of sets up Potter as he really runs the school. But I don't think that's how it plays out. He wants to be that little Napoleon, but actually he's a bit hapless and he keeps, he's the butt of everyone's jokes. And he doesn't have the respect of the head teacher who he desperately wants to respect him.
But my main problem with the character of Potter, it's this very big comedy performance, and I think it's a very good comedy performance. I think Derek Dyler does a good job, but it's completely different to the tone of the rest of the show. I think he is in a different show.
Interesting.
He's doing full-on slapstick clown stuff, big comic reactions, and doing it exactly how you would want that to be done. It doesn't fit in with the rest of the show, which is, for the most part, fairly grounded in reality.
Yeah, I kind of hear what you're saying. For me, the problem wasn't that it was too big, although it was. The problem was that his impact on the other characters just seemed too varied. As I say, there was this sense initially that, it's Potter, he really, you need to be afraid of him. But no one's afraid of him. They sort of treat him as a bit of a joke figure. He makes their life a bit difficult, by not nailing the blackboard back up to the wall quick enough. But he's almost insignificant. I suppose he's the comic relief, is what you're saying.
It put me in mind of The Army Game when we watched that. He is the eye-twitching, cartoonish buffoon that is Snudge.
Yeah.
Whereas was this written as a William Hartnell Bullimore character? The actually a bit more of an authoritarian and a bit more of a real threat.
Yes.
But then, just like The Army Game found out, this is funnier. So let's do it this way. Perhaps it wasn't written that way in the first place.
But the problem is that the privates in the Army Game, he's in charge of them, whereas the teachers are just like, well, we don't care about you. We're not. You're not in charge. You're just a joke figure who wants to be in charge. The dynamic's very different.
Yeah. One other big character trait he has is his malapropisms.
I always enjoy a malaprop.
Well, there's a lot of this. It's such a staple of comedy, isn't it? People just, especially people who are trying to put on a bit of airs and graces and sound a bit more
trying to be somewhat what they're not.
Bigger words, yeah. We've seen Snudge does it, but it reminded me of like Del Boy, speaking French. It's the same principle, isn't it? It's just those kind of, those mangled phrases. And so Potter, like you say, is very obsequious towards the headmaster, and that's how he keeps his bit of power, because the headmaster gives it to him.
The headmaster has no respect for him, as we'll discover later on in this episode. He treats him as a tool to be deployed. But generally speaking, the headmaster he's a very weak figure, isn't he? He's very, he'll do anything for an easy life. He doesn't like any confrontation.
Yes, my least favourite part of the show, I will say. The original dynamic that's set up is that this headmaster is just this not weak-willed figure, because he makes the decisions and then other people have to kind of make it work around him. It's not that he's easily taken advantage of. He set up the deputy head, Joan Sanderson, playing Miss Yule.
Yeah.
She's the real kind of the one who's actually running the place, and he is the sort of puppet of power. And then you've got Potter finagling him as well to just pass off a little bit of power for himself in what little way he can.
Yeah.
But, ultimately they have to answer to the headmaster. There's an episode that deals with the idea of sex education within the school, and how Hedges thinks what they're doing is ridiculous and they're not setting these kids
They're teaching them about rabbits,
kind of
aren't
information. They? Yeah. And it's the headmaster in his kind of old-fashioned ways who's going, we're not teaching that. Hedges stands up to him, and he's going to get suspended for it. But the turning point is that Miss Yule goes, no, actually, I agree with Hedges. And so, once that happens, the headmaster's just like, oh, well, okay, do what you want. It's Miss Yule that has his power, and that develops later on in the series, because, as it's originally set up, she, for some reason, has a kind of silly schoolgirl crush on the headmaster and is constantly vying for his attention, and which is why she does everything for him. And he uses that to his advantage. So later on, she basically meets another man, and that becomes a long-running plot that she's with someone else, and so suddenly she's not so obsequious to the headmaster. And so that becomes a whole thing later on, which is a little bit of character development. Something.
Interesting. Well, yeah, obviously, Miss Yule is the power behind the throne. She's the one who's really running things, and everybody knows it. Do you think there's something in here about a kind of a glass ceiling for female teachers, that they couldn't become head teachers?
I think that's exactly what this is saying, yes. at least in this early series, the only female member of staff as well. You know, so, and she is this 55-year-old spinster.
Of course, no man would have her.
Yeah, and she has to be this very powerful and putting her foot down kind of strong woman to get anything done. That's the only way you can survive in an industry. I think that's all very deliberate. I think it's obviously based on reality.
We talked a lot about the characters. We haven't really talked about any of the actors here. So we know Joan Sanderson. We've seen her in After Henry. We saw her. What else have we seen her in? I mean, she's probably the most famous of the cast, I would guess.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think she's probably the best known, best remembered out of all these. Maybe John Alderson you could make an argument for, but he's more drama these days. Joan Sanderson, yes, this was her breakthrough in terms of public recognition, in terms of TV and all that. She was a well-established, like I say, she was in her 50s by this point. She was well-established. But she did other kind of regular roles, but she's a very memorable guest role in Fawlty Towers, for example. We all know about
Mrs.
that.
Richardson.
In the 80s, she had a couple of regular roles, one in Me and My Girl, and then After Henry, which pretty much ran through to when she died. After Henry, they stopped it because she died.
You did a forgotten sitcom of After Henry. Our listeners can look up on our YouTube channel. But yeah, she was kind of very frail in the last series of that, wasn't she?
Yes.
That's interesting, though. So she's 55 here, and we got in this breakout role. But had she been working since she was 20, or just never made it big?
Yeah, just more in the world of theatre. But we see that so often, particularly in this era when we're looking at these earlier shows, because there wasn't that much going on before. No. And there was a little bit of a stigma, isn't the right word, but theatre was legit, darling, and TV was what you did to make a bit of cash. Because you got to.
What about the head teacher? Who's the actor who plays him?
Noel Howlett. Again, just a very similar story there, but never.
I don't know him from anything.
Well, his very last ever screen appearance was in an episode of Roll Over Beethoven. So.
Oh really? Okay.
but he's got.
He didn't fall off his bike, did he?
I mean, Derek Geiler, who we did mention. Is also perhaps not that well remembered today, but was a huge part of the comedy world. He's old enough to have worked through the kind of the radio circuit, worked with Tommy Handley on the radio and all that sort of stuff.
Oh, okay.
And again, had a bit of a later renaissance in terms of public recognition from this, and then from doing Sykes throughout the 70s, where he was one of the main characters. Did a lot of voice work, as you can imagine. He's got a good voice. Here's a little bit of theatrical history for you. He is the voice of it's like a news bulletin when the radio is played in the Mousetrap, the play, the Mousetrap. Okay.
They just play out the audio. They're still using that?
And they're still using it. So he's been in the Mousetrap for 70 years now. And
excellent.
Still gets like sixpence a show or something like that.
His estate receives the royalties. Yeah.
Which is, that's a curious piece of history, isn't it? And in the 80s, I bet you'll remember this, he was the voice of the skeleton on the Scotch tape adverts.
Wow. Yes. I mean, I can't place the voice, but I know I can picture the character. Yeah.
But yeah, he's one of those guys who was just in the comedy business his whole life, and a really strong reputation, but never got that kind of big starring role that would make him remember. I mean, probably this is what he's best remembered for.
Well, I'll tell you what, let's just, there's a very sort of brief interstitial scene, which I want to talk about because it gives us another one of these classic double takes. Basically, we see Sharon and Maureen walking into school. So they're walking down the corridor in their skimpy dresses, and they walk past Mr. Price, played by Richard Davis. And he sort of walks past, morning girls, and then does this, he turns around and effectively looks to camera because he's looking past the camera at these girls. And it's such a funny face. It's my favourite, it's my favourite shot of the entire episode. Let's use this opportunity to talk about him then. So Mr. Price is the most cynical and grizzled of all the teachers. He hates the kids. He hates teaching. He hates everything about his life and school.
One of my favourite parts of the show, Richard Davis.
Yeah, I love him. Yeah,
I think Richard Davis is just a generally very good actor. I think he's found the pitch of this show perfectly.
Yeah.
Whereas I think Potter, for example, is too comedic. I think the headmaster is just a pointless, sort of worthless character. He's delivering exactly what you need from the supporting character. He's the friend of the main character. He's comic relief. He's the cynical relief to this protagonist who's a bit too optimistic and hopeful. Mm-hmm. It's exactly the counterpoint you need to Hedges.
I totally agree. I think he's every time he's on screen, I'm enjoying his grumpy, cynical nature. Mm. He's Hedges plus 15 years.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. He probably was optimistic once.
Yeah. But Richard Davis is one of those faces. I instantly recognised his face, but I struggled to think where he was from. So he's I looked at his IMDb, and he's sort of been in one episode of lots and lots of things. Bottle Boys, he was in.
Bottle Boys was one of his other regular roles, the Robin Asquith film.
But the thing that the headline on his IMDb is Zulu. He was one of the Welsh guards in Zulu.
Yeah,
which is not sitcom at all, but everybody's seen Zulu,
of course. Yeah. But one-off. He's in an episode of Fawlty Towers as well.
Episode of Yes Minister.
Again, one of those people who's just really reliable. Yeah, turn up, do a nice little guest appearance with a thick Welsh accent.
It's funny because he's Welsh.
Yeah, and I think
there is an element of that.
Largely,
you didn't get many regional accents on television. It's funny because he's Welsh.
And I like it whenever he's surprised when he exclaims it's in Welsh, and Lord only knows what he's saying, but because you probably get away with all sorts of things. No one's checking.
Yeah, you probably could. Yeah. Okay, so that's a very quick interstitial scene, and then we go to the staff room. Mm-hmm. Hedges is there in there with Smithy, who's the older teacher, and they're playing some card game, which I quite like. This is basically I like the way that the staff room is essentially a complete reflection of the classroom. So when the teachers aren't there, the classroom is a bit chaotic, and they're just doing whatever the hell they like. And likewise in the staff room, when there's no kids around, the teachers can be themselves, and they're just playing some stupid game against the wall.
Yeah, when Miss Ewell isn't there.
When Miss Ewell isn't there to catch them. Yeah, exactly. Let's talk before we get into this scene. Let's talk about Smithy. So Smithy's like an old man, and he is a little taken advantage of by the kids. He's the sort of old teacher that you can get away with stuff.
Yeah,
and he seems a little bit of a sad man. I just feel sorry for Smithy. He just seems a little put upon.
And he's out of his era now as well. I think that's the idea. He's not. He went through Oxford and got a position, and he's ended up in this working class school, and he doesn't know how to handle these kids. But if you put him in a tweed jacket and a pipe, as a don, he'd be very comfortable in his retirement years. But he never had the skills for that, I guess. So he's just had to. He's on the scrap heap.
So he's played by a guy called Eric Chitty, like just an old actor, an old sort of theatre and television actor. Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah. Worked for 60 years and has just got credit after credit after credit, but all just one episode of this, one episode of that. But this, again, probably his major role that he will be remembered for, as so many others in the show. Well, that's all we have time for this week, but please do come back next time where we will continue our over-analysis of a sitcom that is more than 50 years old. That's what we do. It sounds stupid when you put it like that, but that's what we're here for, alright? If you would like to talk to us in the meantime, we are on the social medias at BritcomPod if you want to find us. We'll be here again next week, so do make sure you come back for that, and we will see you then. Bye!